In the heart of the lavish royal palace of New York, beneath endless ceilings adorned with frescoes and chandeliers that looked like suspended suns, millionaire Alexander Harris stood tall with a triumphant air. His figure, dressed in a flawless black tuxedo, stood out among the sea of guests. He raised a glass of champagne, letting the light of the chandeliers reflect in the crystal, and with a strong, mocking voice, he threw out a provocation that echoed through every corner of the hall. "If you dance this tango with me, I'll marry you right here, in front of everyone." The echo of his words fell like thunder. At first, there was a brief, almost solemn silence, and then the entire hall burst into laughter. The sound bounced off the gilded walls, descended from the high balconies, and made the marble vibrate under the sharp heels of the ladies and the polished shoes of the gentlemen. The noise blended with the clinking of glasses and poisonous whispers. In the middle of that whirlwind of mockery, hidden among silver trays and discreet shadows, she was there. Helen Ramirez, in a black uniform and white apron, fought to steady her trembling hands. She knew every gaze cut through her like knives. They pointed at her as if she were a cheap spectacle, as if her mere presence were a source of amusement. Many expected her to flee, others wanted to see her cry. No one could imagine that on that very night, in that very palace, fate would put everyone in their place. The chandeliers shone with blinding brilliance, casting warm lights over the expectant faces. The music of the orchestra floated through the air with calculated elegance, as if each note paid homage to ladies and gentlemen in flawless suits and silk gowns. They laughed as they raised their glasses, convinced the celebration belonged only to them. Alexander dominated the scene. The most sought-after heir of the capital moved forward with the certainty of someone who had never heard the word no. His proud stance, the white vest gleaming beneath the tuxedo, the smug, tilted smile, all of it made him the center of attention. Off to the side, nearly invisible, moved Helen. Her hair was gathered in a low bun, revealing a delicate, serene face. She wore no jewelry, no adornments, only the silence learned by someone accustomed to being invisible amid others' abundance. The guests looked at her with a mix of curiosity and disdain, until Alexander tapped his champagne glass with a silver spoon. "Ladies and gentlemen," he proclaimed with theatrical flair, "tonight I want to conduct a little test." A murmur spread across the hall. Some laughed, others waited expectantly. Alexander stepped forward with steady strides, the sound of his shoes on the marble echoed solemnly. He reached Helen, who was holding a tray of glasses, and extended his hand toward her with calculated intent. Helen took a deep breath, as if summoning courage, and with a faint but defiant voice she spoke, her voice faint but defiant. "If you dance this tango with me, I'll marry you right here, in front of everyone." The laughter erupted louder than before. Guests covered their mouths in feigned shock, while others whispered cruelly. The orchestra fell silent, as if also waiting for the reaction. Heat rushed to Helen's cheeks, but she did not look down. Her eyes locked with Alexander's. Though he intended to reduce her to a vulgar joke, a quiet light burned in her gaze, an unseen strength that no one could interpret. Alexander smiled confidently, certain she would back down. The guests settled in as if watching a play whose ending they already knew. But Helen did not move. She gripped the tray tightly, her lips pressed firmly shut. The hall fell into expectant hush, broken only by the faint creak of a fan. If this story has already touched you in these first moments, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to give it a like to keep following along with us. The laughter returned like a cruel echo, magnified by the shimmer of evening gowns and the golden glow of chandeliers. Ladies covered in sequins hid their mouths with feigned gestures, while gentlemen holding brandy glasses leaned forward so as not to miss a detail. Alexander opened his arms, basking in the attention like a master of ceremonies. "Look at her," he exclaimed with mockery. "Our dear servant turned into a princess for one night, if she dares." The hall burst into laughter once again. Helen lowered her gaze, clutching her white apron like a shield. Her chest pounded with muffled heartbeats, her breath turned uneven. She didn't want them to see her weakness. She didn't want to hand them another reason to laugh. But that thirsty crowd would not be satisfied. They wanted to see her humiliated, as if waiting for a final toast. Alexander leaned toward her, smiling arrogantly. "Don't be afraid. It's only a tango. Or do you not even know how to dance?" The cruelty of the question struck her dignity like a whip. Some guests gasped in delight, enjoying the spectacle as if it were a delicious game. A young woman in a jade green dress murmured with disdain. Surely she doesn't even know what a tango is. Helen took a deep breath. The air burned her throat, but she held on to that silence she had used as a shield so many times, even while crumbling inside. Alexander turned to the others, savoring his own cruelty. Gentlemen, I think we already have our answer. A maid is meant to polish glasses, not to dance with a man like me. Time seemed to stop. The chandeliers lit every corner like immobile witnesses. Helen did not reply with words. Instead, she stepped forward slowly, firmly, until she stood before Alexander. Harris's heart raced with the thrill of what he thought he controlled. But when Helen's hand rested on his, something inside him broke. The touch was firm, steady, utterly unexpected from someone everyone believed defeated. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the hall. No one seemed to breathe, no one knew what would happen next. And yet, everyone sensed they were about to witness something unforgettable. The orchestra conductor raised his baton hesitantly, glancing sideways at the guests. It was Alexander who broke the silence with a snap of his fingers. A tango, he ordered triumphantly. Let everyone remember this. The first notes of the bandoneon slipped through the air like a melancholy sigh. The violin followed with a gentle lament, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The mockery gave way to anticipation. Alexander gripped Helen's waist tightly, as if to remind her who was in charge. Relax, he murmured with irony. You just have to follow me. But Helen did not react as he expected. She did not tremble, she did not hesitate. Her eyes locked on his and shone with a disconcerting calm. The first step echoed firmly across the marble floor. Alexander tried to guide her with broad, exaggerated movements, hoping to provoke laughter from the spectators. The crowd held its breath, waiting for her to stumble, to make a mistake, to confirm the joke. But it didn't happen. Helen glided with a natural grace no one could explain. Her simple skirt brushed the floor with perfect precision, her feet seemed to know every accent of the music. There was no fear, no doubt. Alexander arched an eyebrow, incredulous. He tried a quick spin to test her, but she followed like a flawless shadow. The murmurs grew. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He realized he could not allow the woman he himself had tried to humiliate to become the center of the evening. Alexander gripped Helen's waist angrily, as if in that gesture he could recover the control slipping through his fingers. He leaned toward her and whispered in a low, impotent voice. Where did you learn to move like that? Helen lowered her gaze for just a moment. In that silent gesture lived something stronger than 1,000 words, memory, pain, and her mother's voice still whispering deep in her heart. It was as if Carmen Ramirez came alive again in every beat. The musician seemed to sense it as well. The bandoneon cried with a heart-rending lament, the violin released notes as sharp as blades. The tango had ceased to be mockery, it had become a duel that split the air in two. The audience, mesmerized, leaned forward, breath held. No one dared laugh. Fans snapped shut, champagne glasses were forgotten on tables, conversations vanished. All the palace's luxury was reduced to a single image, a nameless maid defying the air with the purity of her dance. Each note pierced the skin like a needle. Each thud of the double bass made the gilded walls vibrate. Helen spun with a precision that seemed impossible for someone in a servant's uniform. Her feet struck the rhythm with confidence, as though she had carried a hidden fire her whole life. Cornered, Alexander grabbed her roughly, trying to force her into a quicker turn, hoping to see her fall. But Helen answered with astonishing fluidity. Her skirt swirled like a dark wing, and her arms found perfect balance. The audience murmured in awe. Did you see her? Whispered a lady with a red fan. She doesn't just dance, she commands. A gray-mustached man shook his head slowly, incredulous. This is no accident. That woman has trained. What was meant to be a cruel joke was turning into a spectacle that exposed him instead. Alexander forced a smile, but control was slipping from him like sand through his hands. Don't get too confident, he muttered through clenched teeth, trying to push her back. Helen held his gaze. In her dark eyes burned a fierce, silent dignity, impossible to break. The orchestra, swept up in the intensity, raised the power of its notes. Violins screeched with drama, the piano struck with force, and the bandoneon tore at every chord. Helen stepped forward, forcing Alexander to retreat. Few noticed, but those who understood tango realized the truth. She was no longer following, she was leading. A solitary clap broke the air. Its echo cracked like a gunshot amid the tension. Alexander clenched his jaw in fury, like a cornered animal. "Who are you, really?" he whispered in her ear, no longer mocking, but tinged with desperation. Helen closed her eyes for a moment and surrendered to the music, to the memory of afternoons when her mother spun her around in a modest yard among hanging sheets. Every step was an offering to that lost voice still burning in her chest. The guests no longer looked at her with disdain. Now there was awe, respect, and in some eyes even a spark of envy. The ridicule everyone expected had turned into an unforeseen miracle. A certainty filled the hall. This woman was not there to be humiliated, but to reveal a truth no one had imagined. The tango blazed through the air like an unstoppable fire. The orchestra, ignited by the energy of the moment, shook the crystal chandeliers. The entire hall had become a silent theater. Each guest was a witness to a mystery unfolding before their eyes. Helen spun with hypnotic precision. Every movement was a heartbeat of memory. The sound of the bandoneon carried her back to childhood, when her mother's laughter filled the afternoons and her hands guided her own. "Dance with your heart, my daughter, not with your feet," came Carmen Ramirez's voice, restoring the strength Helen thought she had lost. Alexander tried to impose himself with shoves and violent steps, but each attempt left him more exposed. His face, once a mask of arrogance, now twisted with the tension of someone who feels defeat closing in. Sweat ran down his forehead, his clenched lips betrayed his fear of ridicule. "This can't be real," murmured a woman in a golden dress, clutching her chest. "Look closely," replied an older man with a hoarse voice. She didn't learn this in secret. She was born for it. Helen's steps grew bolder. A sudden spin left her with her back turned, and as she glanced at Alexander over her shoulder, her gaze radiated a confidence that chilled the millionaire's blood. She was no longer the submissive maid he had tried to put on display, she had transformed completely. The crowd held its breath, as though time itself had stopped. Even the waiters, forgetting their trays, leaned from the shadows to watch. Helen closed her eyes, and the melody swept her back again to her mother's memory, her laughter, her warmth, the way her small hands clung to hers when she was a child. The pain of loss turned into a current of strength. Each movement was an intimate dialogue with the beloved ghost still alive within her. Alexander saw it clearly. The woman he had tried to ridicule was dancing with an invisible force, impossible to break. His fingers clutched Helen's waist in desperation. "Who are you?" he repeated with restrained rage. Helen opened her eyes and met his gaze directly. She said nothing, but her silence was more humiliating than any insult. The music swelled to a powerful crescendo, violins shredded, the piano thundered, and the bandoneon wept as if breaking into 1,000 pieces. The audience rose from their seats, not knowing why, swept away by an emotion they could no longer contain. What had begun as mockery had turned into a solemn ritual. Everyone understood they were witnessing something unrepeatable. The tango reached impossible heights, as if the dance itself had become a prayer. The music roared and made the stained glass windows tremble. The air was so charged it seemed it might shatter with a single breath. Helen spun with relentless grace, without stumbles, without mistakes. Every movement was exact, as though the music had been composed only for her. Her plain dress moved with unexpected grace, as if the humble fabric had transformed into silk under the hall's lights. Alexander, on the other hand, grew clumsy. The arrogance of the first notes had vanished. Now he was driven by desperation. He tried to force abrupt spins and violent changes of rhythm, but every attempt left him off balance. Helen, by contrast, flowed naturally, making him follow her without most of the audience realizing. Alexander muttered in frustration, pressing his lips to her ear. "This is impossible." She heard him, but did not answer. She kept her gaze fixed on an invisible point, on that sacred memory where her mother still accompanied her. Her silence was a weapon sharper than any word. In the upper balconies, the murmurs shifted in tone. They were no longer laughs, but whispers heavy with awe. "I know her," said an elderly woman, narrowing her eyes in disbelief. "That can't be," replied a man at her side, his voice choked with astonishment. "She disappeared years ago." Below, among tables covered with half-empty glasses and forgotten plates, a businessman slowly raised his wine glass without taking his eyes off the dance floor. His eyes gleamed as though he had uncovered a secret. "That woman is no ordinary maid. She carries art in her blood." The murmur spread like fire. The tension grew when Alexander, desperate to reclaim the spotlight, tried a reckless move. He yanked Helen violently, forcing her into a backward spin and pulling her against his chest. His gesture was clumsy, harsh, and for an instant it seemed she would fall to the floor. A muffled cry swept through the hall, ladies clutched their chests, and some gentlemen let out gasps. But Helen did not fall. Her feet found the exact rhythm, and with a flawless spin she regained her balance. Her skirt swirled around her body like a dark wing, and suddenly she stood facing Alexander, her face only inches from his. The contrast was brutal. She breathed steadily, while he panted and shook. The audience burst into an unexpected applause. It was not customary to interrupt a dance with cheers, but no one could restrain themselves. The hall vibrated with unfamiliar energy, a mix of admiration, disbelief, and raw emotion. Alexander, red to his ears, clenched his teeth in rage. The night meant to consolidate his power had become the bitterest of humiliations. Worst of all, the gazes no longer sought him, every eye was fixed on her. The music swelled as if anticipating an inevitable revelation. In that moment, many understood Helen was not the weak woman they had believed. The last note of the bandoneon lingered in the air like an invisible thread no one dared break. The violins faded slowly, leaving a solemn emptiness. The piano released a deep note, and then silence was absolute. Helen stood still, breathing hard, her face flushed from the effort and her hands steady. Alexander still held her, but his fingers trembled, unable to sustain the mask of confidence that had always shielded him. Now he looked small, fragile, stripped bare before everyone. The audience did not applaud immediately, too stunned to react. The echo of the tango still vibrated in the bones of each guest, as if the music had etched itself into their bodies. No one dared to shatter that sacred moment with something as ordinary as clapping. Then a solitary applause resounded from the back of the hall. The sound was clear, decisive. An old man with white hair and a dark suit rose slowly with solemn dignity. His gesture drew everyone's eyes. He struck his hands together, and his applause sounded like thunder. Others followed, first timidly, then more strongly, until within seconds the entire hall was on its feet. The applause swelled until it filled the hall, echoing beneath the gilded domes. Some shouted, "Amazing!" Others wept without knowing why. There was astonishment in their eyes, but also unanimous recognition. The maid who minutes earlier had been a target of ridicule had just conquered every heart. Helen lowered her gaze with humility, as if unsure what to do with an ovation she had never sought. Her hands, once trembling, now rested firmly at her sides. Alexander, by contrast, was petrified. His cheeks burned with shame, his pride crumbled like sandcastles in the tide. The applause was not for him, never had been, and that truth tore at him. Amid the thunder, a clear voice rose above all. "That woman is no stranger," said the man who had stood solemnly. He was a distinguished old gentleman, seated in the front row, with a white handkerchief in his jacket pocket. His gaze fixed on Helen. His lips trembled before speaking the words that would shake the hall. "She is the daughter of Carmen Ramirez, the famous ballerina." A murmur spread through the room like an electric current. Carmen Ramirez, from the Metropolitan Opera House. Impossible, she died more than a decade ago. Helen's eyes welled with tears at the sound of that forbidden name. Her chest tightened as if an invisible knot were choking her. She had never wanted to hear that truth in public, had never wanted to carry that last name before strangers. But there was no way to hide it now. The old man stepped forward, deeply moved, until he stood before her. "I recognized it in your spins, in the strength of your movements. You dance like your mother. With the same pure heart." The murmur grew louder, now mixed with tears and wonder. Helen, her voice breaking, barely managed to whisper, "Yes. I am her daughter." The secret was out. The crowd's reaction was deafening. Some could not believe it, others tried to recall old performances where they had seen the legendary Carmen Ramirez shine on European stages. Alexander swallowed hard. The last name was all too familiar, but he never could have imagined that the woman serving drinks in his own palace carried that blood. Helen stood there, her chest still heaving from the effort, unsure whether to flee or to resist. Her hands trembled, not from shame, but because the past had opened like a wound that had never healed. The old man who had recognized her stepped closer and stood before her. His voice, broken with emotion, came with difficulty. Your mother was a legend. I saw her dance in this country so many years ago. No one had her fire, and now I see it in you. Helen lowered her eyes and fought back the tears pressing to escape. My mother died when I was just a child, she whispered. Illness slowly consumed her, far from the stage and far from everything. The guests listened without blinking. Even the most arrogant, those who had laughed at her before, now felt moved. With a trembling voice, Helen went on. She confessed that after her mother's death, she sought out her father. He slammed the door in her face, denying her recognition. To him, I was a mistake, she said, lowering her eyes. An outraged murmur swept the hall like a roar. A lady with a pearl necklace clutched her chest and exclaimed, "How cruel!" Helen drew a deep breath. Her eyes, glistening with held-back tears, lifted toward the audience. She explained that she had grown up alone, with her mother's memory as her only guide. And though she carried dance in her blood, she abandoned it. She could not bear to hear the music without feeling the absence. That was why she hid, why she took whatever work she could find. It was her way of surviving, her only way of concealing who she really was. Alexander stepped forward, nervously brushing imaginary dust from his jacket. His lips quivered with rage and disbelief. The thought that this night, planned to reaffirm his power and showcase his grandeur, had ended up crowning the very woman he had treated as mere entertainment tormented him like slow poison. "Enough with the theater," he shouted, overpowering the audience's emotional murmur. "Don't be fooled by a forgotten name. Maybe she can move her feet, but she's still just a maid serving drinks in my house." Silence fell instantly. The echo of his voice crashed against the gilded walls and faded. The guests looked at one another uneasily, avoiding direct eye contact with him. Alexander's tone, far from commanding respect, sounded desperate, like the roar of a wounded animal. A silver-haired lady looked at him sternly. Her firm voice cut through the air. "Don't speak that way, sir. What we saw wasn't a whim, it was art." The old man who had revealed Helen's identity raised his hand indignantly and added, "No, Mr. Harris. This woman had art in her blood, the legacy of Carmen Ramirez, and tonight she has proven it before us all." The murmur swelled, heavy with indignation. The air filled with whispers and reproach. Alexander clenched his fists, stepped toward Helen, and spat bitterly. "Do you enjoy this? Do you enjoy seeing me ridiculed?" She held his gaze. The timid girl who once carried trays was gone. Before him stood a woman upright, with a tear-stained face and unbroken dignity, and a dignity impossible to break. "I didn't seek you out, Alexander. I only accepted your challenge. You yourself called me to the center of the hall." The guests nodded in silence, they had all heard it. A voice rose from the crowd. "She didn't seek the spotlight. You are the one who exposed her." The color drained from Alexander's face. Never in his life had anyone confronted him like this, much less before the elite gathered in his own palace. "This is absurd," he roared, though his voice no longer carried the same strength. Helen took a deep breath. Her voice rang out clear, unwavering. "I am not absurd. I am the daughter of a mother who taught me to dance with my heart. And though I hid it for years, tonight I have found it again." An unexpected applause rolled through the hall. This time it was not timid or isolated, it swelled into a thunderous ovation. The guests rose to their feet, clapping fervently. Alexander was surrounded by an ovation that was not his. He tried to smile, but the smile crumbled. The power that had always protected him was falling apart before his eyes. He realized the humiliation was no longer Helen's, it was his. The ovation thundered through the gilded hall as Alexander, flushed, lifted his hands to ask for silence. He struggled to breathe, he felt the weight of hundreds of eyes fixed on him. The mask of the untouchable had fallen, and he knew it. "Listen to me," he said in a trembling voice that strained to sound firm. "This has all been a misunderstanding." A murmur of distrust rippled through the hall. No one seemed to believe him. Alexander took another step toward Helen, forcing a smile. "I didn't mean to offend you. What happened here was unexpected. I admit I was wrong in how I acted, perhaps fate wanted us to meet this way." The word, fate, hung heavy in the air. Some exchanged incredulous looks, others indignant ones. "Fate," retorted a lady in a red dress, nearly spitting the word. "You humiliated her in front of everyone." Alexander ignored her and stepped closer to Helen, extending his hand solemnly, as if he could still reclaim authority. Helen Ramirez, today you have shown us who you are, a strong woman, a true artist. I ask you to forgive me." The tension was dense, vibrating. Everyone waited for Helen's reply. She looked at him calmly, though inside a storm of memories surged through her, her mother reminding her that dignity cannot be bargained, that purity of heart is worth more than any wealth. "Forgiveness," she finally said firmly. "Do you know what that word means, Alexander? It is not a trick to cleanse your wounded pride. Forgiveness is truth. And you still have not understood it." The audience reacted with an intense murmur. No one had ever dared speak to Mr. Harris like that. Alexander stepped back half a pace, bewildered. I can change, I promise you." Helen shook her head gently. "I'm not asking you to change for me. If you ever do, it will be for yourself." The old man raised his voice firmly. "This woman does not need your last name or your money. She already has the greatest thing of all, the dignity you tried to take from her." Immediate applause followed. The entire hall rose again, not only to admire the dance but to defend Helen. Alexander was cornered. His last maneuver had collapsed in his hands. Helen drew a deep breath. Her serenity moved everyone as she declared, "I hold no grudge, Alexander, but I will not play your game again. Tonight did not change my destiny, it changed yours." The audience erupted in cheers. Defeated, Alexander bowed his head for the first time in his life. The hall felt different now. The cruel laughter of an hour earlier had transformed into a chorus of applause and acclamation. The echo of the ovation seemed endless. No one spoke of Alexander anymore, no one mentioned his wealth or his eccentricities. Everything revolved around Helen, still in her uniform, with tears sliding down her cheeks and her eyes shining with a force no one had ever seen in her before. The invisible woman was invisible no longer. The old man raised his glass and proclaimed solemnly, "Tonight we have witnessed a miracle. Not only the return of Carmen Ramirez's spirit, but the redemption of her legacy in the strength of her daughter." The audience toasted with him, raising their glasses and chanting her name in a unanimous cry. "Helen! Helen!" Alexander, standing apart in a corner, watched with a pale face. No one looked at him with admiration anymore. Those who once laughed at his jokes now avoided him. The humiliation was total, but different from the one he had intended. This one carried the unshakable weight of truth. Helen inhaled deeply, stepped forward, and lifted her voice, clear, firm, resonating in every corner of the palace. "I did not seek this night, nor did I ask to be at the center. But I understood that hiding who we are is also a form of abandonment. For years I kept silent out of pain, out of fear. Tonight I realized my mother never fully died, because she lives on in every beat I dance." An emotional murmur ran through the hall. Some wept openly, unable to contain what they felt. "Forgiveness exists," Helen continued, her clear voice echoing in every corner of the palace. "But it is not about excusing cruelty or forgetting harm. It is about not letting it steal what we love most. Tonight I did not dance for Alexander, nor for you. I danced to honor my mother and to remember that even in the midst of humiliation, hope can be born." The audience rose to their feet again, applauding powerfully. This time it was not just admiration, but deep respect. The musicians, carried by the solemnity of the moment, joined in by softly striking their instruments, as if closing a sacred ritual. The sound was grave, ceremonial, almost religious. Alexander tried to open his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, the words caught in a knot he could not undo. Helen looked at him one last time, serene, her calm in stark contrast to his trembling. "Perhaps one day you will discover that true greatness is not measured in money or in mockery, but in the ability to connect with a pure heart." He lowered his head. There was no possible reply. His shoulders slumped, as if for the first time in his life he felt the weight of all his decisions. The orchestra, of its own accord, began a soft melody. It was not performance music, it was an homage. The tune wrapped the hall like a silent embrace. Helen, with calm steps, began walking toward the exit. Each step was steady, decisive, as though she was finally freed from a weight carried for years. As she advanced, the applause followed the rhythm of a triumphant farewell. The ovation was not only for the dance, it was for the woman who had transformed a night of humiliation into a lasting symbol. That night New York would remember only one name, and it would no longer be Alexander Harris, but Helen Ramirez. The evening was etched into the memory of everyone present. What began as a display of power ended up revealing the quiet strength of a woman who had borne pain, abandonment, and loneliness, but had never lost the purity of her heart. Helen did not need riches or a famous last name to shine. It was enough to be connected to her mother's memory, the hope she had carried since childhood, and the courage to face contempt without lowering her gaze. Her dance was not just a performance, it was an act of redemption, a bridge between a wounded past and a luminous present. Alexander Harris, on the other hand, discovered the hardest truth in the face of dignity. His wealth, his bought applause, and his false friendships crumbled in seconds like sand between his fingers when the truth stood bare. And though he asked for forgiveness, he realized true forgiveness cannot be demanded, it must be earned with humility and profound change. The entire hall had witnessed a miracle both simple and grand. A woman who once seemed invisible had become a symbol of respect, of hope, and of human dignity. Because, in the end, what remains is not the mockery or fleeting wealth. What endures is the ability to forgive, to keep faith in family alive, to honor those we love, and to dance, even in the midst of pain, with an open soul and a head held high. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Tell us in the comments which part moved you most. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming stories. And don't forget to give it a like. If you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family, this story is for you. And before you go, take a look at the story I've left here on the left. I'm sure it will move you and make you reflect as well.